So, shall we? Okay. I think first thing just to say is I hadn't realised that we were going to have such an authentic temperature this evening. But if you can imagine yourself in Bengal in 1947, but I mean, do please sort of get drinks and be as comfortable as you can. Or if you get too desperate and you want to go out, I shan't be the slightest bit offended. It's a great. It's a great privilege to talk to you as an audience. As I had the great privilege of talking to you about 20 years ago about Stein and the Silk Road. I also had the honour to give the address at the annual dinner once. But why it's a real pleasure this evening is because so often talking about partition, a theme I will come back to, people don't know the sort of the basic facts, which strikes me as being quite extraordinary. But to be able to talk to an audience like you who do means that I can go rather further. So I'm not going to give you the Janet and John of partition. What I am going to do is give you what I think are the misconceptions and myths. Some of them will be contentious. Some of you will disagree with me quite profoundly, I suspect, on some areas, and I'm very happy to enter into debate. What I was going to do, I think we want to be finished by about by sort of 8:30. Harvest 8. So I will talk probably for about 40 minutes, and then we can go into sort of 35, 40 minutes of debate. But say if anybody has to go beforehand, please do. I mean, totally understood. So that's the book. I should have bought paperback copies, being rather uncommercial. I'm afraid I haven't. I would say, rather immodestly, it has actually now become a bestseller, which is rather satisfying. But it's become a bestseller in India, which is even more satisfying, because there are those in India who don't like the idea of British generals writing about Indian history. But actually, the reception, I've been on a couple of lecture tours in India, has actually been very gratifying. And I think what is really people like is the fact that actually there are books coming out about this incredibly important subject in the English language now. Why did I write it? I wrote it because I was, rather bizarrely, commanding the southern sector in Iraq in 2008. And I'm not ashamed to say this, I mean, with the British Army was wondering what on earth we were still doing in Iraq, in Basra, in 2008. And whatever reason there might have been to go in after Saddam, and that's a different story, there was absolutely no reason to still be in Basra so many years later, without any proper development programme. Had we been rebuilding Basra, had we been doing work on the sewers, electricity, etc., then I think we'd have been more welcome to the Iraqis, but also there would have been more point to our presence there. But there wasn't really, and we were really there because we were sort of tethered gate because the Americans didn't want to be left on their own. And that got me thinking, really, actually, we've never been very good at this country at finishing on our foreign interventions. Many of you would argue we shouldn't do foreign interventions in the first place. Another debate, another story. But given that we have, we never seem to be able to actually finish them to the greatest advantage to ourselves and to our host nation, if you can call them that. And you go right back, I mean, look at the American War of Independence. I mean, it's probably one of the crassest things that actually has happened in terms of British overseas policy. And so I find myself sitting in Basra trying to make something work that quite palatably wasn't working, and was of no benefit really to either the Brits or to the Iraqis. Also, the other thing about Iraq is you can't escape the Indian legacy in Iraq. As you probably know, Mesopotamia was won from Delhi. It was part of the Indian portfolio, and there is a very strong Indian army presence still. I mean, that's the wrong word, but sort of lingering spirit of Indian army, not just war memorials. The Basrais would take great pleasure in saying to me, your grandparents gave us the botanical gardens. So your grandparents gave us the bridge over the Chateau. Your great-grandparents gave us the botanical gardens. What are you going to leave us? Well, I was tempted to make a slightly irreverent comment at that point, but I didn't. But it struck me but actually we were in Basra in a totally microcosmic way. There's no way am I going to try and compare what we were doing to British India, but it did strike me that actually being on the sort of fulcrum of its political military interface, but just wasn't working in Iraq. Maybe actually I was just one of a long line in a very, very minor way of people who've been in the same position. Long interest in India. I spent a long time in India as a student. But the other thing which actually has always upset me about India is why this huge part of our history is not taught in our schools today. And it does infuriate me that my children learn about the American Civil Rights Movement in their A-level. So there's nothing wrong with the American Civil Rights Movement, great news, what wonderful part of history. But why do we learn about that and not learn about British India, about the creation of Pakistan? You look at the population of this country who are of Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi ethnic origin. An awful lot of those families are here directly because of partition. An awful lot of Bangladeshis from Sylhet, an awful lot of people who had to move from the Punjab, either from east or west, actually end up in the UK because they can't settle either in the west or the east Punjab, particularly those that actually went into West Punjab. It's a huge part of our history. It's a really important part of our history. And I think what happened in 1947 is in itself a really sort of key part of how we develop as a nation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a series of points. And as I say, some of you won't agree with them. Some of you will be able to, probably with more experience than me, be able to argue against them. But the first point I'm going to make is that by 1947, the Raj, as we remember it, King Emperors and Raj families, was well and truly finished. It had finished arguably at the end of the First World War. And we go into that very curious period between 1919 Amritsar and 1947, when we are in this period of political and developmental stasis. I think there was an urgency to find a solution to this in 1947, which seemed to pass Westminster by. And I'll just read you a quote from the book, from Ismay, who is a reliable, Pug Ismay, who is a reliable guide to the period, and of course went out with Mountbatten, having been Churchill's secretary in the war. Two things played on Mountbatten's mind. First, he quickly come to realise that India was nearer to a complete breakdown of law and order than his masters in London appreciated. Ismay noted that communal bitterness had grown to incredible proportions since I was last in India. Ismay was an Indian Army officer, he was an Indian cavalry officer. A spirit of bitter animosity had been rampant throughout the country for several months, and there was tension everywhere. There was no knowing when a new outbreak of unspeakable violence might start. Whitehall at the time, 1947, was more consumed, bizarrely, with Palestine. And if you look at the cabinet papers for the period, which I had the pleasure of doing, you'll see the amount of time spent debating Palestine versus India is disproportionate. We had the great Calcutta killings in August 1946, Jinnah's sort of day of action, which should have been evidence in themselves of how serious the situation would get. In 2 days, in August 1946, we had 5,000 dead on the streets of Calcutta and 10,000 seriously injured. And what really shocked people as early as around August was the level of intercommunal violence, and also warning of just how serious intercommunal feelings were. It was a truly terrible period with the gangs running amok. In October in 1946, there were massacres in Chittagong and Tapera and Nokali, which is the southern, as many of you know, it's the southern bit of Bengal down towards the estuary. And those were actually mostly, whereas in Calcutta it was largely Hindu or Muslim, those ones outside Calcutta were largely Muslim or Hindu. In Bihar, obviously a separate province from Bengal by now, in October 1946, 8,000 Muslims massacred. And at the awful Garmucha Fair massacre, 6th, 7th of November, you have 2,000 Muslims killed in a cattle fair. An incident, funnily enough, which has still not been properly investigated. The files are still open on it in Delhi. They probably never will be. And there was hardly a day that winter of 1946 to 1947 without a serious number of murders across northern India. Then you had the rape of Rawalpindi in March 1947, at least 5,000 people killed, nearly, again, mostly Muslims on Sikhs and Hindus, and 3,000 seriously injured. And then you have this terrible violence that started in April near Delhi. This is a photograph taken of a little Meow boy who had his arms cut off on the site of the head wound. You can't see one arm is missing on the side of what is now Indira Gandhi Airport. The Raj was not functioning. It had not really been functioning before the war. It functioned extremely well in the war due to the supreme efforts of men like Slim. But actually, the civil side of the Raj had really stopped working. Perhaps the worst evidence of this was the Bengal Famine. Now, the Bengal Famine is perhaps one of those incidents that, again, I don't think gets nearly enough attention. It left, between 1942 and 1944, it left 3 million people dead. So if you think that the total casualties of the Commonwealth Empire, whatever you want to call it, in the Second World War were 500,000 roughly. So you've got 6 times as many British subjects dying of starvation in British administered territory in 2 years during the war, when we were digging for victory, escorting convoys across the Atlantic, and eating Woolton pies and other disgusting things. But the point is, there was a huge effort made to feed the British people. There was no effort made to feed the Bengalis. And what is, and I'm very happy to enter into debate with this because I know this is contentious, but there wasn't a shortage of food. It was a matter of distribution. The price of rice more than doubled in 1942 from 6 rupees per maund, and a maund is about 82 pounds, as you probably know, to 14. So it's gone from 6 to 14, over doubling in a year. By August 1943, it reached 37 rupees, a 6-fold increase in 18 months. Although by 1943, the food supplies in Calcutta, Bengal generally, were 11% higher than they had been in 1942. Now, this is an administration which is suffering the huge pressures. There was a Japanese invasion, there was an army coming back from that. I'm not saying there wasn't, but what I'm saying is that actually it was a huge blow to the moral authority of the Raj, to what was left, that actually happened. And the scenes, that's Calcutta, that's just off Sharingi Avenue in Calcutta. An awful lot's been made of Churchill's refusal to allocate shipping and grain to Bengal, but actually that's a bit of a red herring. The problem, as a wonderful man, Sir Frederick Burrows, who some of you may have read about, who ended up as governor of Bengal in 47, ex-trades unionist, marvellous man, he's the one who came up with that classic comment that when his contemporary governors were hunting and shooting, he was shooting and shunting and hooting as a whalewoman. But Burrows actually said the world's during the famine an almost complete breakdown of the administrative machine. It was really this man who is one of, I think, the heroes, although he couldn't sustain it, who put an end to the famine. And I'll just read you a bit of introduction and then an entry from his diary. This is describing a visit to Bengal in 1940, in the end of 43, October 43. Even if they made it to the cities, there was little relief available. Camps were set up around Calcutta, but could only take 55,000 people, a tiny proportion of the requirement. By August 1943, 2,000 people were dying on the streets of Calcutta every week, although Lear Amery, the Secretary of State for India, actually would argue it was only 1,000. In a city like Calcutta, dead bodies are lying on the road, said Bankin Mukherjee in a speech on the 6th of November. A child dies in agony in the lap of its mother while the mother leaves it behind. Wavell, on his first visit after he'd taken over as Viceroy in October 1943, wrote that he'd seen a destitute woman and several destitute children in a bazaar near Contai. The children were sucking water out of a bucket in which an old gerbag had been placed. A mental demoralisation took control of the victims, Wavell noted. Children reduced to skin and bone had got in the habit of feeding like dogs. You tried to give them a decent meal, but they'd break away and start wandering about and eat filth. By October, any form of mutual respect had vanished. The villagers are themselves getting callous about it. One village head said to me about those dying, "What does it matter? They are the useless ones." So, I mean, I think the point about it is, a huge amount of effort had to get into the war. India was, whatever Congress would say, as threatened by Japan as the British Empire was. But let's look underneath that a bit. The ICS by 47 was badly under-recruited. Jock Colvin, another one of those hugely distinguished governors, the governor of Bombay, had lost 70% of his civil service by the beginning of 1947 and 90% of his police. And he was running Bombay with its 30 million people with 22 civil servants. If you look at the last budgets for the Raj, the 26% of the budget went on the military. 14% on the railways, 1% on health, 6% on education, which was the same as on official salaries and pensions. So here we have a system which was hugely distinguished in all it did in the past, was actually geared to maintaining law and order and expanding India. We're completely unable to change its pitch to develop what should have been becoming a modern economy. And the other thing which I think was grossly unfair is that revenue from income tax was only 7%, whereas in the UK it was 45%. And most taxes in India, particularly salt, of which more in a minute, were from salt, land and customs. I think the other thing which is rarely of note is that the police were ineffective. They were incapable in Calcutta and Bihar. They were totally ineffective in the Punjab, and we'll see more about that later. And they were also seen as strongly biased. The only thing left working in 1947 rarely was the army. The army was still enormous. It was 500,000 people, 500,000. And there are also 100,000 Brits and Gurkhas. And the Gurkhas have this sort of rather enviable position in India, whereby they're not seen as one or the other, they're seen as Indian troops, but completely impartial. And often you would find during the events to come that actually people would ask for Gurkha battalions because they knew that they would behave properly. And the army then was, we're so used to armies now sort of being rather small and not great forces of land, but that army was massive. It had its own factories, its own transport, its own Auchinleck commanded the Air Force and the Navy as well. He was also in the cabinet, on the Viceroy's cabinet. So this is a mighty beast. So that is my point number one, that actually in 1947 things were almost out of control and there was an urgency to sort them out that passed London by and actually posed a particular problem. Point number two, I would argue, is that Congress realised this, and they realised that India was slipping out of control. And the first thing is they were absolutely longing for the Brits to go. We were still there in 1947 like a bad dream. Congress was old. Gandhi himself was, there he is on the Salt March, was 78. Gandhi is fairly ageless because he was his extraordinary diet and way of life. Patel, the great man of Congress, strong man of Congress, was 72, and even Nehru was 58. But Nehru spent his whole awful lot of his life in prison, and he'd lost his wife, and he'd been through a very traumatic time. And these leaders had spent their entire lives working for something they knew was inevitable and they knew was going to happen. But the Brits were still there. Every time they woke up in the morning, we were still there. There was still no progress to actually getting rid of us. Secondly, they were becoming increasingly alarmed by this rising violence, and that they were worried that they would inherit a fragmented country. And one of the things about Congress is, however much they criticised the Brits, they were very good at analysing why the Raj had worked. And they realised that the Raj worked because it always maintained that very strong central control over foreign policy, security in the military, and communications. And they were absolutely not prepared to let any of those powers be franchised out to the regions. And actually, during the first half of 1947, they actually realised in any future India they wanted to maintain much tighter state control of finance, not unrelated actually to Nehru's socialist beliefs. So there was never going to be a chance, whatever Gina would argue, and we'll come back to that in a moment, of actually Congress agreeing to a federalised India. Which Jinnah held out for so long. There's absolutely no way that they were going to share power with Jinnah or the League. And they saw that almost as sort of tantamount to anarchy, and not just control over finance, but Nehru had been influenced by Ho Chi Minh, he'd been influenced by Moscow. They saw strong central control, and you see that in some ways India's developed today, how important that was. But whatever they were going to do, they weren't going to share power with Jinnah. They just didn't like Jinnah, they didn't. Nehru actually would admit he is a man of exceptional ability, although typical Nehru, he had to add, but a very mediocre lawyer, which was untrue. It went right back to Nagpur, but in 1920, when Jinnah had been part of Congress. We didn't like the fact that he had reorganised the League very effectively, actually almost identically on a Congress model between 42 and 44. But he'd toadied up, as they saw it, to the Brits when Congress were in jail. in the last years of the war. But the thing which rarely they proved them they couldn't work with him was trying to take share of a Constituent Assembly work in 1946 and the beginning of 1947. And they thought Jinnah's vision of Pakistan, and this again some will disagree with, as a dual federalised system with effective power transferred to the provinces in India, to the Punjab, Bengal, Sindh and the Northwest Frontier province would mean that the Muslim League would effectively control those assemblies, they'd lose central power, and they just were not prepared to go there. It was reinforced by Nehru's experience in the Northwest Frontier province. And again, you probably don't need you to point it out, but this province up here, which is, of course, a vast majority Muslim province, but which bizarrely had elected a Congress assembly in the elections. And Nehru, in his insistence that Congress spoke for all Indians, whether Muslim or Hindu, was absolutely convinced that actually if there was going to be some form of partition, if the Northwest Frontier province with its Congress government was going to come into India, then actually all Pakistan would be Sindh and possibly a bit of Bengal, and was really a non-starter. He had a very unsatisfactory visit. That is a picture of a Pathan tribal leader trying to kill Nehru. In the Northwest Frontier province, and Nehru came back from that visit violently anti the Muslim population there, and violently anti this man, a great man, Olaf Karo, I think pronounced it Karo. And Karo absolutely insisted that if there was going to be any form of partition, there had to be a separate plebiscite in the Northwest Frontier province, which indeed, as you probably know, there was duly in July. But I think that was, if you like, the final argument that made Congress realise that they really had to go for some form of solution which would end in partition, because if there was an election there and they elected a Muslim government, of course, as they would do, then actually you started having a collection of Muslim provinces which looked as if they might break away. I'm just going to read you a bit, because I think one of the things also that, one of the things I don't think, this is a very arrogant thing to say, but I don't think Nehru, who was effectively a socialist, Nehru saw India in terms of sort of capitalism and Marxism. He saw it as he didn't really, and he would say this himself, so this isn't me sort of arrogantly presupposing I know his views better than him. He didn't really see the real depths of the religious and communal antipathy, particularly in the Punjab, and he would admit so later. Let me just read you a quote from a Sikh, from a very thoughtful Sikh called Bahadur Singh from Rawalpindi. Interestingly, he wrote this before the rape of Rawalpindi. This is written before March 1947. He thought his community, the Sikh community in Rawalpindi, treated Muslims with shaming. He had been taught by a Muslim woman and thought that when we needed them, they were always there to help. Yet when they came to our houses, we treated them so badly. If a Muslim was coming along the road and we shook hands with him, and we had, say, a box of food or something in our other hand, that would then become soiled and we could not eat it. If we were holding a dog in one hand and food in the other, there was nothing wrong with that food. How can it be that two people living in the same village and one treats the other with such respect and the other doesn't even give them consideration due to a dog? And I think that is really the root of some of where Nehru's misunderstanding came from. So when we get to May 1947, we have a partition plan because Congress really can't think of anything else to do. They can think of no other way forward. Nobody really wanted partition. Jinnah certainly didn't want it, and you'll think that's odd, but I'll come back to justify that. Jinnah wanted a model based on the Palestine White Paper of 1939, a hugely influential document, which he set enormous store by, and which I think, despite the Lahore Declaration, was always very much in his mind. And just to remind you what that White Paper on Palestine said, it said the Brits aimed to create an independent state in which Jews and Arabs shared government in such a way as to ensure that the essential interests of each community are safeguarded. And why that is what guided Jinnah through. through the beginning months of 1947. He always would say he's the sole spokesman for India's Muslims. So why would you go for a plan that actually leaves an awful lot of those Muslims, almost arguably most of them, behind in India? So partition is something which Congress is reluctantly coming to because they're longing for the Brits to go. They need to get on. They can't work with Jinnah. They realise actually that if there's going to be a plebiscite for Northwest Frontier Province, then actually the idea of some sort of partition is viable. And this cartoon, in the middle of Hindustan Times, but I think is actually remarkably apt. It shows Jinnah and Liaquat Ali, his great first Prime Minister of Pakistan, who's probably now was sadly assassinated. And actually it's rather more truthful, I think, than the cartoonist realised. Because, of course, here it starts off with Jinnah saying that he's not going to accept just having what eventually becomes east and west of Pakistan. He's not even going to accept it if it has Hyderabad and all the Punjab. And even if it has sort of United Provinces and Bombay. And it goes on, and actually, that is what he genuinely believed. He saw Pakistan as a federal arrangement where he shared power with Congress. And the last thing he actually wanted was to have partition. And that is why there is no clear plan as to what Pakistan is going to be by the time we come to early June 1947, because it hasn't been formed. Pakistan is a nation, even then. And that is why Jinnah actually, about the first time in his life, gets caught short. And if you look at his reaction to the 3rd of June meeting, which we'll come on to in a moment, it's one of almost panic. And he sends Liaquat Ali back in to see Mountbatten that evening. Liaquat had a very good relationship with the Brits, unlike Jinnah, saying that this was totally unacceptable, that if they were going to insist on having a separate country called Pakistan, they'd have to split the army, which he thought would be the one thing the Brits would never do. And actually many Brits thought that too, a lot more of that in a minute. He also said, you're going to leave an awful lot of people here, so it's going to be a huge strain on Britain to keep running this country for some time. And he said, thirdly, of course, it would mean you've got to stay, even leaving civil servants here, you've still got to stay yourselves as a Raj for another couple of years while we get it set up. I'm not saying that Congress wanted partition. Congress didn't want partition. Gandhi absolutely hated the idea, and he took considerable persuasion. But they went for it, as I said, because it got rid of the Brits. It meant they could develop India without the distraction of Jinnah. And they also thought it only lasts for a maximum of 4 years. Patel famously described what ends up as Pakistan as a rural slum full of forcibly converted Hindus, which is insulting in any way you look at it. But Patel was a man of strong words. Third contention, Mountbatten. There is a myth, I have to say, strongly encouraged by the principal himself, that Mountbatten was all-powerful. I actually knew Mountbatten a bit. He was Colonel of Lifeguards when I was actually Blue and Royal, but I used to see him quite a lot. He was a regular luncher in our mess, and he was actually fascinating to talk to. But without being unkind, because he actually did, I mean, in many ways, he achieved a huge amount in his life. But his problem was that in old age, he tended to ascribe powers to himself that he didn't have. And he spoke to two very fluent and, I would have to say, gullible journalists in Collins and Lapierre, who produced that wonderful book, Freedom at Midnight, which is an enormously good read, but it's historically doubtful. And Mountbatten ascribed to himself all sorts of powers and decisions which he simply never took. And when I was writing this book, I talked quite a lot to Douglas Erskine Crumb. Douglas Erskine Crumb's father, Vernon, was Mountbatten's private secretary. And Douglas talked to his father a lot about it, and Vernon had said it was an absolute nightmare being Mountbatten's private secretary because he'd never have him in the room when he had a meeting. And as I'm sure those who've been involved with government know, that any self-respecting minister, ambassador, general, whatever, will always have somebody there to take a record and be able to actually act as a neutral record, objective record of what happened. So what Mountbatten used to do was to have his meetings, then call Vernon in afterwards and say, this is what I said, this is what they said. And then poor Vernon had to spend the rest of the day howling around Delhi, trying to find the other person in the meeting to get some sort of accurate record. But I do think Mountbatten was a very good ringmaster. And people will disagree on that, I know, because his history has not treated him kindly. But given that he really didn't have much power himself, I think he actually played what little power he did have quite well. He got on very well with Gandhi. He got on, when Gandhi came to see him, the Viceroy's study was one of the few rooms in Delhi that was air-conditioned. And but because Gandhi always insisted on wearing his dhoti, and when the temperature outside was sort of in the 40s, they had to turn the air conditioning down for about an hour before he came in case he ended up with pneumonia from sitting in. But Mountbatten, he did genuinely get on, and as I think is well known, Nehru got on very well with the Mountbattens. But I think actually, no, I mean, joking apart, Nehru and Mountbatten did have genuinely a very good relationship, and if you read Nehru's comments afterwards, he comes a little condescending in old age, but I think he did actually value it. But the real influence was Cripps and on Acton. And what Mountbatten found when he arrived in Delhi was actually there was a back channel operating. And that back channel went through Nehru to Krishna Menon, the man who Time magazine famously put on their front cover later in life with a jar full of cobras, when he was Indian Defence Secretary, and was Indian Defence Secretary interesting when China invaded, which perhaps wasn't his finest hour. But he was the Congress representative in London. He had a very strong line to Cripps. And Attlee, if you look at Attlee's sort of in-tray, in 1947. I mean, I'm a great Attlee fan, and I think it's absolutely phenomenal what Attlee actually achieved. But he relied on Cripps, who knew India very well, had very set views on it, to brief him on India. And actually, the cabinet's direction on India is coming from Cripps. And of course, it was Cripps who relied on the famous Cripps mission, which Gandhi was so dismissive of in the war, sent out actually on Attlee's insistence. But actually, what Mountbatten found was that the policy making was being taken by Nehru through Cripps to Attlee and Krishna Menon. And some of you may recall there was a sort of great hiatus in the end of May when the cabinet said, what the hell's happened to the plan for independence? We said we're going to announce it, but actually nobody's given us a plan. The reason there was no plan, and Mountbatten was prevaricated, was because it was being written by Nehru and by VP Menon, not Krishna Menon, who was the reforms commissioner in the government. And Mountbatten really was a bit part player in this. So all this nonsense we hear about he decided this, he decided that, I mean, it's simply not true. But what he did do was sort of put the sort of top cover on it, he put the presents on it, and of course he orchestrated the meeting on the 3rd of June very well. He didn't get on at all with Jinnah. There's a famous quote, I'm sure many of you know about this photograph, of when Jinnah arrived in the Rose Garden in Rajtrapati Bhavan, Viceregal Lodge in Delhi. And when Jinnah arrived, he assumed that Lady Mountbatten would be in the middle between him and Mountbatten. But he was so nervous, he still trotted out the same line to the press of, a rose between two thorns, which Mountbatten didn't think was very funny. And the other thing is, which I think is critical on this great 3rd of June conference, when we announced the partition plan, when Congress was happy with their plan, they gave it to Mountbatten. Mountbatten sent it back to get it agreed by the cabinet, who simply simply sort of signed it off, as though they had tried to amend the earlier plans. And that is that famous conference in the Viceroy's study with Ismay in the background, with Jinnah beginning to look ill, come more to that in a moment, and Nehru, when they announce independence and partition. And there's another myth here, which Mountbatten put about, that the date was his idea. And there's a theory often here advanced. People say, well, I blame Mountbatten for bringing the whole thing forward, and making it all happen in such a rush, because he wanted to get back and run the Navy. I'm afraid, again, is two myths. A great myth, first of all, he stayed on as Governor General, so he didn't want to come back and run the Navy, and he had to wait a long time to be first sealed. But he certainly didn't decide on the date. And he would say, I chose the date because it was the date of VJ Day. Come back to this issue of Congress pressure. I found, writing this book, a wonderful series of envelopes written by Gandhi in pencil on a train, which was a note to Mountbatten saying, and written the last week of May, saying, you're going to announce on the 3rd of June, independence and partition, go that week. Congress wants you to go. Nero and I want, and it's still, you can see it. It's in that wonderful book that that Moon edited called The Transfer of Power. So there was real pressure from Congress for the Brits to go. They just want to get on with it. And the reason that we come up with the 15th of August date is it's the nearest date that actually a British parliamentary process makes possible. But this is primary legislation. You cannot make Indian independence without going through a British Act of Parliament. And the Conservative Party in opposition, obviously, are actually very helpful in this. But actually, the soonest you can get something through is by the end of July. So they choose a date which gives them a bit of working time, a couple of weeks after the end of after they can get the bill through Parliament. But this idea of Mountbatten saying afterwards, I chose the date, and actually the reason he could never justify it when questioned on it, of course, was he didn't decide on it. But it puts a huge amount of pressure, particularly on Jinnah. And one of the things I do in the book is I look in quite some detail at how he tries to set up Pakistan virtually from nothing. Let us look at another myth, the Boundary Commission. Myth number 4. Radcliffe and Christopher Beaumont, his secretary. Sorry, let me find that. Cyril Radcliffe, Christopher Beaumont. Interestingly, and I hope I won't offend those of you in the judicial profession by saying this, but the government had asked for a very distinguished judge, and they were told by the Lord Chancellor at the time that this task was not of sufficient priority, and none were available. And when Radcliffe was finally selected, the clerk of his chambers wrote a wonderful letter to the Prime Minister saying that I assume that Mr. Radcliffe will be entitled to his normal reimbursement, which was, again, these are important things if you're a lawyer. The Boundary Commission, the myth of the Boundary Commission is that it sat in sort of glorious isolation in a bungalow on the vice-regal estate in Delhi and never got out. And I'm afraid, again, it is complete rubbish. I mean, that photograph is taken in Simla. And that was taken, actually I borrowed that from Beaumont's Christopher's son, who's a friend of mine who's a journalist in Yorkshire, lent it to me. They travelled widely. They spent a long time in Bengal, where Radcliffe spent the night awake because he wanted to see whether he could see Warren Hastings' ghost in Government House. And they were also, I think, pretty fair, but they did make changes. And this idea that he sat in glorious isolation, drew the lines, and when nothing changes, again, simply not true. And again, many of you will know that the famous change is the change they made to Firozpur and the Zira district on the Sutlej, which was, of course, going to go to Pakistan, but through a combination of pressure from Bikaner, the state of Bikaner, and from Nehru, it was allocated to India. He was also accused of allocating Gurdaspur to India instead of to Pakistan. I don't think that's actually true. I think he was always going to give Gurdaspur to India. And if you look at the communications to Kashmir, sorry, you've already put a map up to just go back a bit. Let me go back to a map. So I can tell what I'm talking about. If we here, so you. We're talking about, there's Kashmir up here. You're talking about this area, yeah, where you actually need to be able to get from the Punjab, sorry, to one side of the line there, up into Kashmir. So we're talking about that area there. So let's go forward. And when you look at what the Boundary Commission did, sorry, let's flick forward again. You look at their lines, the partition lines. Actually, they're not quite as crazy as some people hold on it to be. Certainly, the Bengal line. So here we have Bengal, Indian Bengal, West Bengal, and here we have East Bengal, Bangladesh. Sorry, other way on. So I'm talking rubbish. So there we have what comes East Pakistan, East Bengal. That line there actually is almost identical to the line Curzon drew in when he partitioned Bengal. And it's interesting, actually some of the old school Indian civil servants would say, well, of course Punjab was a mess because Punjab's totally nouveau. I mean, it's only been with us for, a century. I mean, it only came in the 1840s, whereas in Bengal our records go back for miles. There's actually some truth in that. So, and of course they had much more accurate land records in Bengal, and they used the police station records for boundaries, for communal boundaries, whereas they had to use for tax districts in Punjab, the Tussils, which are much bigger blocks to deal with. But I think yes, of course, it's totally unsatisfactory to rush partition boundaries through like that. I'm not in a way trying to excuse that. But given the pressure from Congress, I think Radcliffe is slightly maligned, actually, by history. I mean, it's not. He felt very bitter about it, and he really felt it sort of slightly destroyed his life and his reputation. Contention number 5, Maharajas and princes. This is what people thought of Maharajas at the time, particularly, I think, the Americans. Many of the princely states in 1947 were extremely well governed. Bhopal, which we now remember sadly for that ghastly Union Carbide explosion, there of Bhopal, who was Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes, and a forward-leaning, conscientious, hugely impressive man, who was also an Air Force officer, as you can see. And it was really him who took the brunt of the debate with the British government and with Congress on what would happen to the princely states. But most of the princely states, with exceptions, which we will come to, actually were remarkably sensible. And they didn't have to be. So, for example, Travancore, Maharaja Travancore, argued quite coherently in Delhi that his state had a bigger population than Australia. It had a treaty with Britain. Why should it not become independent like Australia? And actually, in many ways, you could see the logic. Of course, it didn't. There's absolute anathema to Patel and Nehru with this rather socialist view of what India central control meant. The other man who I think is hugely, wrong thing to press, impressive is this man, Hanwant Singh, Jodhpur, Maharaja of Jodhpur, very sadly died in a plane crash quite soon after independence. His family were hugely helpful in writing the book, and actually there's a lot about Jodhpur in here, because they've got a wonderful family archive in Jodhpur. But Hanwant Singh, and you look at how partition was managed, and we'll come back to that again in a minute, in Jodhpur, it is hugely impressive. There's very little violence, there's very little death, but the state railway sent right into Karachi, the outskirts of Karachi, to bring people back. You look at the way the state is governed anyway, there's no famine in Jodhpur, there's no Bengal famine in the princely states. And that tells you something. Travancore had probably the best primary education system in India. So the idea that the princes were sort of behind the times and anti-everything is, I think, unfair. Most realised the future of India demanded their concurrence, and most were extremely patriotic. Much has been made of some of them. Much has been made of this man, Unagad, I would argue, which was a state down on the very close to the Sindh, which held out to get into Pakistan. He was a Muslim, his population were Hindu. He adored his dogs. He spent huge amounts of money marrying them off. But it was, of course, his divan, known as Mr. Bhutto, whose name will reoccur in Pakistan politics, who was, I think, more of a trouble there. The Nizam, and of course Hyderabad will hang out as will prevaricate until for a year after independence. And this man, Hari Singh, who's probably the villain of the piece, who is the Maharaja of Kashmir, a Hindu in an overwhelmingly Muslim state, and whose prevarication and the British government's reaction to whose prevarication has, of course, caused so many of the problems for the moment. But I think this that's, if I clear, we're about to come on to rather a nasty bit of his presentation, I'm afraid, which, and I'm afraid the last 10 minutes is rather taken up with what happens in the Punjab. But what happens in the Punjab doesn't happen in Jaipur, and if you go to the middle of Jaipur now, you've got a thing called Sindhi Market in the middle. That is an area that the Jaipur family actually took all the Hindu refugees from Karachi. You go to Jodhpur, you have almost no violence, and you have in Jodhpur even today a really good multi-ethnic state that functions on a truly multi-ethnic basis. So what was about to happen in the Punjab needn't have happened. It was always going to happen to some degree. But it shouldn't have been any surprise that it happened. And this man is another of my heroes. This is a man called Evan Jenkins, who was the governor of the Punjab, who is one of those sort of class of Indian civil servants who I think achieved a peerless degree of refinement and sophistication in terms of how you are a government servant. Hugely dedicated, criticised and bitched about by all sides. Not supported strongly by Delhi or by Mountbatten, but actually runs the most difficult state in India in multi-ethnic terms, and in as near exemplary way, I think, as you possibly can. Jenkins has been warning for a long time that there is going to be terrible violence in the Punjab if partition goes ahead. He bases that on the rape of Rawalpindi. He's seen the Sikhs since the rape of Rawalpindi arming themselves. He's seen them going into military groupings. The Sikhs are extremely good at organisation, more so, I have to say, than the Muslim villages. And between March and August, the Sikhs were armed. And he'd been warning Delhi, he'd been warning Auchinleck, and we'll get more in a moment. And he said, and this was just after the war, so people like this, when they talk about military stuff, we do know what they're talking about. He said you will need a minimum force of 4 divisions, so it's 100,000 people minimum, to police this if you are going to partition the Punjab. And it falls on deaf ears. And we'll come back to that in a moment. In last week of July, he told Mountbatten that in that week alone, 4,632 people have been killed in the last few weeks. Amazing how he managed their record keeping, even at that time. It's fantastic. And 20,256 houses have been destroyed in Lahore alone. Although he did admit the true figures were likely to be much higher. And the scale of violence that then occurs is, it should not have come as a surprise, but everybody afterwards said, oh yes, we never expected it to be that bad. Well, there was always going to be a refugee problem. People were always going to leave. Muslims were going to leave Indian Punjab, and the Hindus and Sikhs were going to leave Pakistani Punjab. The scale of it shocked people, I think, from going through all the various records. I think probably between Bengal and the Punjab, about 15 million refugees took to the road. And again, as I said at the beginning, quite a lot of those never ever settled and have ended up in countries like ours. And scenes like these are all photographs taken from the Punjab over that period, are pretty sickening. And then, of course, it's not just the refugees, but we get into the rape and murder that takes place at the same time. And it is one of these things which I'll come on to how it could have been avoided. I just see if I can just, sorry, I've lost the place in the book. I just want to read you a bit from one of the BBC correspondents in the this is Winfred Vaughan Thomas, who I think was one of those wonderful BBC radio journalists. A long line of bullock carts stuck in the middle of a drenching rain. Each cart carried a desperate, rain-soaked family. The carts staggered on. There was no hope left amongst them. As we go on, the rain lifted and the sun beat down. The whole countryside sparkled, but in each village we passed, we could see the reason the refugees were on the move. We could see armed gangs chasing their victims across the field. By the time we interfered, it was too late. Another family had been wiped out. And I was just going to read you another quote, which is disturbing, and this is from a Sikh. Because one of the things that actually people are going to ask afterwards is how could people sink to the level that they did? This is a man called Singh Dhillon. We went off raising war cries, even leaving our food. We'd go off in high spirits. I ran this Muslim through with my sword and killed him. My sword was a good one. It used to look magnificent. It used to feel good. They had killed so many of our people. We used to shout war cries and then chop people's heads off. We would cheer each other up and shout, "Be strong." I was very successful. The old and young would talk about me. I've lost count of the number of people I've killed. There were so many. Whoever came in front of me lost his head. Why should I feel bad? They kept killing our people. They wouldn't stop. Half our people have been killed. They said it was a good thing to kill us. And we have that really terrible situation, 50 million refugees and 1 million people killed. So why did it happen? Why was the army not used? And I major on this in the book. This is Auchinleck, who is a great man, but he's a hugely powerful man. He has a viceroy who doesn't really know much about India. He has fledgling governments in Delhi and Karachi who have very little interest really in the military. He controls not only the army but the Indian army. He controls the British troops in India. He controls the Gurkhas who are part of the Indian army at this stage. He controls the Indian Navy and the Air Force. But he is, at the time, preoccupied with dividing the army between India and Pakistan. And we get this rather absurd position that the army becomes focused on its own organisation rather than doing the job that it's there for. In 1946, the army ran in India an exercise called Exercise Endeavour. And Exercise Endeavour's purpose was to rehearse almost to the T what actually happened in the Punjab, to the extent of policing for trains, of running logistic camps for refugees, etc., etc. The communication and everything was put in place, but we get to June 1947, and there's plenty of time for an army to react between the 3rd of June and the 15th of August. I mean, armies are designed to move quickly, it's what they do. But absolutely nothing happens apart from a very weak force put out under a wonderful man called Pete Rees, who is, again, one of my heroes of this operation, whose papers are all in Brighton University. I'm always interested in seeing them. I don't quite know why they're in Brighton. I think he ended up living in Sussex. But they absolutely recorded to a T everything that happened in the Punjab in August and September, very neatly in all the war diaries of the 4th Indian Division. But Rees is given 15,000 troops to deal with 17,932 villages in an area the size of Ireland. And not only that, but he's given a lot of the troops are local. And the one thing anybody who knows the Indian Army will tell you don't do is put Muslim troops in the Punjab to police the Punjab. And you don't put Sikhs troops in to police the Punjab. So, why actually did this happen? The other thing is that, there were plenty of troops. There were plenty of troops there. That's Auchinleck again with Jinnah. The reason I show that is it shows Jinnah's illness is really coming on very strongly by then. So you had not only the Indian army there, had been totally reorganised after the war. You had the British army. You also had the states' armies, some of whom behaved rather well, some of whom, like that in Bahawalpur, actually behaved rather badly. But the troops were there, the air force is there, the transport is there. But the other thing which is there, which is again often ignored, is in June a joint command structure is put in place. It actually, both Nehru and Jinnah sign up to Auchinleck as Supreme Commander. He has Indian and Pakistani staff, even as early as June. There is a joint headquarters established, and he does have the authority to mediate and to deploy troops on both sides of the border. So there's a question here. I mean, there's a question of why does this army that takes a quarter of the budget, and the Indian army is designed for internal order. It fought magnificently under Slim, completely reorganised in the 14th Army, but it had been reorganised after that. It had been reorganised back onto its old class basis of recruiting Sikh and Muslim companies and squadrons. Interestingly, one of the senior officers who sat on the commission that decided that was Enoch Powell. I think as a military man, I think there are questions to answer because, the breakdown of relations was not inevitable. why do relations break down? Why do two countries which start off, who could have had a relationship like England and Scotland, end up as both nuclear armed powers? Why do you end up with a Pakistani budget which probably conservatively 30% is spent on the army? Officially it's 12% if you listen to the Grudge figures. Actually, I reckon in Pakistan the actual real figure spent on the military is much higher. In a country which is desperately crying out for development. Why is India spending this enormous amount combating Pakistan? Well, it goes back, I'm afraid, to this. It goes back to the fact that what happened in the Punjab, our failure actually to grip it. There was always going to be casualties. I'm not pretending for a moment that that actual thing could have been bloodless. There were always going to be refugees, but actually the degree of it, 1 million people killed, 15 million people as refugees, is odd, exceptional, wrong. It's disturbing. Breakdown relations were not inevitable. On top of then to Punjab, this is my 8th contention, and it'll be my last. You had then Kashmir, then you have Indian troops emplaning on civil airliners going up to Kashmir. And Kashmir, if you like, that's the Sikhs attacking the Pathan tribesmen, or defending Srinagar from Pathan tribesmen, who were quite a rough lot, as you can see from that. And it's, it was Kashmir Rally then and the prevarication of Harry Singh that actually, in the end, makes the relationship break down completely. Many would argue Pakistan was never viable. It was clear from the very beginning that it was never going to work as two halves of the same country. And it was absolutely clear that the West and East couldn't work together. That was that apart. Actually, it's perfectly possible for India and Pakistan to achieve more of an understanding than they did, particularly when Liaquat was alive. Liaquat is going to Delhi right through the beginning of 1948, having sort of monthly lunches with Nehru. It wasn't really inevitable that all this actually should happen. And then once it's over, what is really left is the psychological shock. And I think it's that photograph which is in many ways the tragedy of 1947, actually a young generation, the generation who were children then, whose lives were ruined by it, if they survived at all. And I think recovering from the psychological scars is still something which confronts us in this country as well as it does in India and Pakistan. I've said enough. I've left half an hour. If anybody wants to grab drinks or anything and cool off, do please, because I do appreciate it is rather hot. But over to you.
Thank you. Barney, thank you very much indeed. Apologies to everybody for the heat in the room. We have done what we can, that is to say, we have turned all sources of heating off.
Why don't you speak here?
Unfortunately, we can't open the doors because the alarms will go off. But lots to discuss there. And I see immediately. I have a question here, a question there. Can I take a third one and then a gentleman there, and then I'll come back for more in a moment.
Was it an unforeseen circumstance that Pakistan, once it was divided, became a country, ended up with a sort of homogeneous population of Muslims? And was it anticipated that that would be the case? And if there had been no partition,
Keep talking,
if there had been no partition, what problems do you anticipate would have arisen? Would there have been more civil wars vis-a-vis on religious grounds, and perhaps India would have been beset by fallout of ISI and all that other terrorism going on at the moment in Pakistan? What would have happened if there had not been the partition? And maybe it would have been a bigger country confronting China.
We take a sort of cluster of questions in a group.
Barney, you've quoted the figure of 1 million casualties. Pendrell Moon, in his book Divide and Quit, published about 10 years after partition, actually thought that was grossly over-exaggerated, and he estimated something like 250 to 300,000. Can you comment on that?
Yep, certainly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
According to your narrative, and even otherwise, was the Congress in 1947 a Hindu party? Two, one more question. When various members were advising the Viceroy, Mountbatten, don't divide the army just now. And you have people like Rajendra Prasad saying, if we partition, then not a day will we have a joint army. Why was that?
Right, I mean, gosh, that's already... keep me going. I'll try and be... Probably they're all such fascinating issues. I'll answer them all, and then you want to come back because I skate over stuff. Pakistan's a homogenous nation now, and absolutely not Jinnah's intention ever. And actually, of course, it isn't now. It's perceived as such. Jinnah went to enormous pains in October and November, as did Liaquat, to emphasise the multi-class, multi-ethnic, multi-religious nature of Pakistan. But of course it became seen as that, and of course as always, and that's actually partly the answer to another question, is it becomes seen as a Muslim country, and it is of course called the Islamic Republic, but on the flag, which Liaquat and Jinnah design, there is, of course, a third white, or is it quarter white? Anyway, there's a white bit, and that is meant to represent all the non-Muslims. And of course, there's an awful lot of Hindus in East Bengal. An awful lot of them will then migrate. They haven't all migrated. I mean, there's still quite a sizable Hindu population there now. So, no, it was a deeply upsetting issue, and I'll come back, so I just want to answer about Congress. And I think I'll just take the Congress answer now about Congress being entirely Hindu, because again, the absolute sort of core of Nehru's belief was that Congress spoke for all Indians and Gandhis. But there is no doubt that, although that's what they said, the perception, and the Muslim perception, encouraged by the League, encouraged by Jinnah, and despite there being high-ranking Muslims in Congress, I mean, the president of Congress is even a Muslim at one point in the 1940s, then it is seen as the Hindu and Sikh party. And once these perceptions have taken root, they're very difficult to shift. And the comments of Patel, again, I'm a fan of Patel. I think Patel is one of the great Indians of the last century, although he has a slightly sort of sad ending, if you like, because when he and Nehru fall out. But Patel is very direct. Patel actually says, all Muslims are always converted Hindus. That's quite offensive, actually, to even then. I mean, now it would be, obviously, he'd be sort of strung up for saying it. But, I mean, even then it's taken as a... So the issue is perception, I think, to both those two. And I think the tragedy of this is that actually you however good your intentions, given those mass sort of feelings and given the strength of the feeling, and I read you that rather sad comment of a Sikh in Pindi, that is what actually tends to influence people. Coming back then to your second question, what happened there wouldn't have been partition? I think, to be fair, I mean, Nehru and Gandhi are no fools. I think partition, I think by the time we got to where we did in 47, partition was inevitable. Because there was no other way, really, of, they would say, making Jinnah face up to what he'd always been demanding. But really, there was no other way of getting rid of the Brits, because what Jinnah desperately wanted was for the Brits to stay on. As we know, he wanted them to stay way beyond 1948. And of course, the initial announcement, his initial announcement in February 1947, had been that they would stay till 48. So Jinnah wants that. It plays to his agenda to continue to argue for this sort of federal setup in India. So I think if you're Congress, and given the fact that we have made such a nonsense of the 1920s and 30s, I think partition is sadly inevitable. Read Nero's great speech on the 15th of August, his famous speech, we made a tryst with destiny. Just read the words of that carefully again. It's a fantastic speech. It's certainly one of the great speeches of the English language. And Nero's voice is marvellous. He's on the listening project. It's on the tape in the British Library. It's probably get it on YouTube. It's a most wonderful speech. But he says, we haven't. He actually says, I can't remember the exact words, and I won't try and paraphrase. But he says, we're not redeeming our tryst wholly, but we're doing it in part, and it's the quickest way to getting what we want. And he actually says that so often. I think we sort of ignore what politicians actually say and actually judge and say what we wish they think they should have said. But it was that is it's really, so I think it was inevitable. Casualties. I think Pendle Moon would later have revised that opinion because, and Mountbatten himself, Mountbatten came up with a moon figure and was then heavily criticised for it. Once the sort of dust had settled, there are many estimates, nobody knows exactly, but I think the consensus of sources since and the work done by both the Indian and Pakistan governments since would argue for a much, much higher figure. I say 1 million, I haven't said 975,000, I've said 1 million because it is a generic figure, but I think we are dealing in that in that scale. And Moon, I think, I'm a great fan of Moon. Pendle Moon was this wonderful Indian civil servant who was actually the agent in Bhawalpur during all the trouble and saved a lot of people's lives. And if you haven't read his books, they are just fabulous. Two of them is a little book about sort of the state of India, and then what's the 47 books called now? What is it called? Divide and Quit, yeah. And it's, I think he would otherwise argue that it had increased. And then the last question there, the army division. Why was the army divided? The army was divided because Jinnah insisted on it. Because Jinnah thought that by making the army divide itself, despite its very close relationship with Auchinleck, that actually it would make the Brits think twice about partition. It would make them, they would be so unpalatable that they wouldn't do it, they couldn't bring themselves to do it, and that therefore they would be able to delay partition. Somebody who helped me hugely writing this book was the son of Auchinleck's MA, Hassan Hamid, and his brother, who's a general in the Pakistan Army now, who's a good friend of mine, and who their father kept a very thorough diary. And it is absolutely clear that despite how closely the Cade and Auchinleck got on, and Auchinleck used to call him the Cade, but they had a huge respect for each other, that it was Jinnah who absolutely insisted on it happening. The other thing I just say quickly on armies, you see, if you're Nehru or Gandhi, what is an army? Well, an army is something that beats you up when you protest. You don't have experience of running armies. And it's all very well for me as a general, to actually seize all the good sides of armies fairly naturally. But if you've been in Congress, what the British Army in India has done has been there to preserve the Raj. It's given a monopoly of security to the Raj, which in many ways is inimical to what you actually want. And it's also quite rough to see an awful lot of your countrymen volunteering to serve with Slim in the 14th Army. And again, the Indian record of voluntary service in the Second World War is fantastic. But you've seen your countrymen go and do this while you've been languishing in jail. You're trying to get rid of the Brits, and here are the Brits recruiting your countrymen to fight for Japs who, I personally believe Japan posed a very serious threat to India. But Nehru certainly didn't believe that. And Nehru actually then is very sympathetic to the Indian National Army and to Bose. And that defends Bose, and he's trying. Not defends Bose, Bose he did. So he defends the three Indian National Army officers who they put on trial in the Red Fort, and Nehru actually defends them. So I think there's a different sort of perception slightly on armies to that. I don't think Nehru thought the army was important. It was only later when he became Prime Minister and governed the country that he realised it was. Sorry, I'm banging on.
1, 2, 3. That's all.
If I've heard correctly, which I may not have done, Auchinleck could have done a little more. Do you think he was put off by two things, the memory of Amritsar and also his wife leaving him in Delhi?
You didn't hear that.
So the question was, did we think Auchinleck could have done more? And was he put off by memories of Amritsar, he died in 1919, and by the fact his wife had just left him?
I would like to say something about the Cabinet Mission Plan, because the Cabinet Mission Plan was thought to be a possible solution.
Yeah.
And that would have involved a sharing of power in a central Europe.
Yeah.
And Gino was perfectly willing to have that. You would have had a common currency, a common army, and so on, a common foreign affairs, and you would have had these three units, which would have had very substantial powers in all other fields. Now, it was Nehru who went backward,
Totally. Yeah.
Many people feel that that was a great missed opportunity, really, for a different kind of solution.
What do modern day Indian and Pakistani politicians, historians, commentators say about partition?
Can I take those three? Right. Let me start with Auchinleck. Auchinleck's a great man. He was, some would say, the distinction of being sacked by Churchill as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, as Wavell did too. Many people would argue that actually Alamein was Auchinleck's plan. Not Montgomery's. It's difficult to take a harsh line on a man who's such a stalwart and such a long-standing public servant. And the loyalty that Auchinleck inspired in India is almost legendary. He's a brilliant linguist. He spoke. He was in a Punjabi. He was a Punjabi officer, but he spoke Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi. He also spoke Bengali, and he spoke Kakali. I mean, he would actually go. He would go to an Indian regiment, and he would pick out every viceroy's commissioned officer or sort of quartermasters, we'd say, almost by name. And his whole life had been in the Indian Army. His father died when he was young. He'd been brought up in conditions of extreme penury when in a boarding house in Brighton, and he only really got into Sandhurst because he won a scholarship to Wellington. So there's so much about Auchinleck which is so laudable. But I think what really Auchinleck felt was that he found dividing the army incredibly difficult. He also had, I think, not so much memories of Amritsar, although he may have done, actually. I think that's a very fair point. But we must remember that the scars of 1857 hung over India still, and Auchinleck had joined in India when people were still alive who lived through the mutiny. I mean, he fought right through the First World War, so he joined in the early 1900s. So I think that those were definitely things he was frightened of. He hated the idea of actually having Indian troops sort of deployed in their own areas. But the thing which I think is more serious is why not use these British troops? Now there is a disgraceful piece of paper signed by the Labour government, which I find it's something now which I think wouldn't happen, which says that on no account are British troops to be used to save Indian life, only British life. And that is signed off by the Secretary of State of India in July. But nobody questions that, nobody countermands that. And you do find, during that awful summer, these British brigades, there were 6 of them, they were, in the old days, British regiments were garrisoned with Indian regiments hanging over from the mutiny. By after 1945, that didn't happen. They were separate units, they had their own logistics, their own transport. And there's, again, I put some in the book, some of the British officers seeing what was happening were absolutely incandescent that they couldn't help. And that expression, going Doolally, as I'm sure you know, comes from British troops being stuck in the transit camp at Doolally near Bombay. Actually, it comes from this time. People just being sort of so frustrated that they couldn't actually get on and help. I think Auchinleck could have used them more. I think he could have remonstrated with the Labour government. I think his relationship with Mountbatten could have been more helpful. And at that rank in the public service, it is your duty to get on with people you work with. You can't let personal issues get in the way. I think he was very upset by his wife. She went off with another officer who was actually older than him. I think he was deeply upset. But even so, he's a professional soldier, so that shouldn't really have clouded his judgment. On the cabinet mission plan, Congress were never going to accept the cabinet mission plan, and that is why they prevaricated with it. No, but they didn't. I mean, they didn't. They've never actually implemented it. In that awful torture sort of coming and going in 1946. But Gandhi, if you remember, when he actually did initially say, "Yeah, okay, we can live with this," he very quickly went back on it. And the reason that they weren't going to, and the reason that Nehru then spun Plan Balkan, which was the first plan that they produced in May 47, was for exactly that reason, but it actually allowed too much sharing of power. It allowed a federal, exactly as you say, it allowed this federal system. And Congress's attitude had hardened by 1947, but they'd seen the state that India was getting into. They'd seen the level of violence, and they'd seen the real sort of likelihood of civil war. And they were just not going to go for anything, but didn't give them that central sort of control of security, communications, and foreign policy. I mean, actually regional policy, really, but essentially security and communications. And at the Congress Working Committee meeting in the last week of April, that is when Patel adds to that. That is when they put the final nail, if you like, in any possible agreement about a plan like the cabinet mission plan. That's when they say they'll take taxation powers. Essentially, they won't agree to the regional assemblies regional governments having the power of taxation. So yes, in the early days, when they were desperately trying to find a solution, but I would argue they only ever really played lip service to it. Because if they really had accepted it, they would have developed Menon's Plan Balkan. So Plan Balkan is the one which was, without getting too complicated, was developed in the early weeks of May, because it was actually quite similar. But they wouldn't. They were absolutely determined to have that that central control. A man who helped me enormously with this book is a wonderful man who many of you will know, Neil Seal, who is Professor of Asian History at Trinity, Cambridge, who is, you wouldn't think it meeting him, but is of in advanced years. But he, of course, he was alive. He lived as a teenager in Delhi through all this. And he was absolutely adamant, I'm talking to him about that very point, he said, "No, absolutely no way, by early 47, that Congress were going to take anything other than a transition that gave them really sort of total central power." The modern views, I think one of the things which actually is so good, and I think actually points to all the good that was done in India. I know there's an awful lot of bad done too, and I know it's very fashionable to trash the Raj and say it was all awful. Some bits of it I think were actually rather good, and I think one of the lasting legacies that's come out of it, which I think is so endearing, is the very warm relations that actually we enjoy as countries between Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India and the UK. And I think that's partly because so many British people are now of Bangladeshi, Pakistani or Indian origin, which is a huge strength. But actually, if we think about it, what I think surprised the Raj so much is that the British people saw those links as being there and being much stronger. And actually it was the Raj which was sort of rather out of date by the 1920s and 30s. And there's marvellous diaries, again, which I've used in the book, of soldiers who went out for the Second World War, British soldiers, who were quite used to, actually living on a very perfectly friendly basis, with their neighbours, being absolutely amazed at the sort of segregation that was still going on in India. There was an Indian Member of Parliament in Westminster long before there was one in Delhi. So I think that somewhere was a warmth, there was an understanding. And I think as a result of that, actually, we've got a generation who have been very understanding about transition. I think they're much less understanding about isolated incidents. And I think something which we'll all have to concentrate on next year is Amritsar, because it's 100 years in April 2019. And it may not escape your notice, it's also going to be the middle of Modi's election campaign. I don't think the British government's ever officially apologised for Amritsar. You could argue, how could they, because it wasn't the British government, but actually, you can hardly get the Indian Army to apologise for you, it would obviously be absurd. So I think, things like that people take a very harsh view of. Amritsar was a complete disgrace. I mean, it was one of those black marks. It was a bit like some things went on in Dublin in 1916. But that's people seem to mind much more about that than they do in 1947. And I think that shows a patience and understanding which is, I'd say, I think it's probably based on the fact that there's quite a deep friendship there.
We have just sort of 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to take 2 more questions, I'm afraid. William Crawley and Roger Cross.
Yes, I'd just like to take up two points that you made about the background. One, Punjab. You were saying that Punjab in particular was a hornet's nest, I'm not going to use that word, a hornet's nest of communal violence and antagonism. And yet up to 1946, the Muslim League had no standing in Punjab. It was a unionist government, very harmonious relations between all communities. I mean, how do you account for that total breakdown within a matter of a few months? My second question is out of allocating blame or explanation of the Bengal famine. I mean, you're very hard, and rightly so, on the failures of the British administration. One of the mitigating factors that people have tried to put forward about this, and I wonder what you think about it, is the refusal of Indian provincial governments, which were then in Indian hands, to share any of the surpluses that existed in neighbouring states, which could have greatly relieved the shortages of food in Bengal.
Roger.
Yes, following on from that, more of a comment. I think it was on Archive on 4, on Radio 4 a few years ago about the Bengal famine. A lot of the problems were caused by the grain merchants hoarding. So you can't blame it totally on the British administration.
Okay, let me just talk about the Punjab and then the famine. Your point about Punjab is absolutely right, but the Punjab has actually been more troublesome than maybe we believe, because it had it was produced most of the army, and because it also produced most of the grain. It had quite a good standard of living. It had quite a good income, and there were also some of the more successful large development projects were in the Punjab, in the canal zones, the reclaimed land at the top of the rivers. But the trouble with the Punjab is that it was. It is where it was, and having a mixed Sikh, Hindu and Muslim population. The League were always furious that they couldn't. The League thought they always had the sort of God-given right to govern Punjab, but Jinnah never really understood the Punjab. He hardly ever went there. And he relied too heavily on his lieutenants. They never really built up a League basis of support in the Punjab as they did in places like the UP or Bombay, or obviously in Bengal and Sindh et al. But it was really that issue of having Sikhs and having Amritsar and having these communities, these divided communities, and the fact that actually whatever happened, once you have partition, you again have a line through the middle. It was almost, it wasn't inevitable. But what I would just quite like to do is to draw a bit of a comparison with Bengal, because why is there not the same violence in Bengal? Well, I don't want to hold you here all night, but Bengal's been divided before. The communities actually divide up much more neatly on those police station divisions. The Boundary Commission takes some very sensible decisions about how they allocate areas and districts. But effectively, it's because the population blocks sort of split up. In the Punjab, they don't. They're all intermingled together, and a lot of that is to do with how the Punjab is settled. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that the Sikhs were absolutely determined that they were going to make their mark. They were absolutely not going to be part of Pakistan. So, you'd always have the seeds of a problem there. I think the Unionist government actually did as good a job as it possibly could. I think the real hero, I think, is Jenkins, who held it together basically without a police force. But let's just come on to the famine. The point you make is entirely, absolutely right. I absolutely agree with you. And there are food stocks in the rest of India. The grain merchants are hoarding. But come on, if the grain merchants are hoarding and the price is exploding and you're in a wartime situation, what's the government do? I don't just sit there and say, right, grain merchants, you've got a right to hoard. You actually put in, why are there no price controls put in? Why is there not a cap put on the price of rice or corn? And the problem, again, is not so much one of shortage of food. So even if you've got the surpluses from other Indian states, and they are there, absolutely, and they're recorded in great detail in the official report. But you've got to get there, and you've got to move them around, and that's where the administration falls down. So even when when some of those Australian ships do come in with grain, eventually in 1943, after Wavell's threatened to resign about 6 times, the grain is left rotting in the docks because nobody can move the stuff. So it really is I've looked at it. I take no pleasure. I'm not sort of trying to be sort of anti-Raj or anti-empire. I'm just looking at it practically. It could have been avoided. And when Wavell goes his first visit, within about 3 months, Wavell has diverted military resources which have been used for the build-up against Japan. He's put in military hospitals, he's put in supply regiments, he's put in infantry battalions into areas to keep law and order and to run field kitchens, and he has produced food. It was administratively possible, and he did it. But the question is, why was it not done before? Why was it not done in 42 and 43? So I think I slightly rest my case on that. I'm afraid I don't. I think it is fair to actually say that it could have it could have been avoided. There is, again, you read the book, the correspondence between Jack Herbert and Linlithgow. Linlithgow was the viceroy up until Wavell came, 43, and Jack Herbert was the governor of Bengal in Calcutta. It's not edifying. In one marvellous entry, I'd love to get rid of so-and-so because he's quite incapable, but he would so upset his wife or something if I did. It's that sort of thing, which is, a war, for heaven's sake.
I did say I was only going to take 2 more questions. I have conceded a very short question over here. Yes.
Not been too. Not at all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. So, yeah.
Congress is opposed to the two-nation theory that Hindus and Muslims form.
Yeah.
2 nations.
Absolutely opposed to it. Yeah.
But it accepts a Muslim state of Pakistan, a Muslim state which is called Pakistan.
Yeah.
It automatically follows logically that India becomes Hindustan and a Hindu state. The secularism is tossed in because without that, Kashmir can't be kept. Comments?
Yeah, the row that went on. If you're interested, go into the London Library and look at the transition of power and look at the volumes between June and August 47. The rows that went on about whether India should be Hindustan or India. And it goes back to the question here about about the cabinet mission plan. There's absolutely no way Nehru and Patel are going to accept Hindustan as a name. It's absolutely out of question to them. Pakistan is the renegade. Pakistan is the break-off. It'll last 3 or 4 years. It's a rural slum. Won't work. It's all Jinnah's vanity. That's certainly not going to share federal power with him. They are India. India is, in the nature, soul of India. India is them, is what. But it becomes quite testy and was wonderfully sort of, was marvellous sort of civil servantish, sort of foreign office English, of civil servants trying to sort of mediate between these extreme positions. But I can absolutely assure you that if Nehru or Patel were standing in this room here, they would say, you must be absolutely joking, we were ever going to call ourselves Hindustan. It was just not, just not there. And it's the same point, but it's this demand for, and I think it's right to say that it did come about. It was getting stronger. So I think in the early part of 1946, they were seeing whether they could make the Jinnah plan, the plan book and the federal plan work. But as I said, things like the insistence on having a plebiscite in Northwest Frontier Province, the total impossibility of working with Jinnah, it just reinforced their view, which ultimately why you get this partition plan. It's almost a plan of desperation, but they don't think it's going to last. They think it's going to be over in 4 years.
Barney, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
I know that there are people who would still like to ask questions, but I'm afraid I do have to draw the line there. Thank you very much for surviving the sort of climatic sort of atmosphere we managed to create for the topic. Could I ask you, please, to thank Barney in the customary manner, but especially also, please, to show your appreciation to Gary Alder for his now very long association with the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. We're very pleased to have had them both this evening. Thank you.